Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Culture Feeds. I'm your host, Yaparoni. Thanks so much for joining me today. And I know this episode is coming out a little bit late. I apologize, but we will be back on track next week. I promise you. It's just something about gloomy weather where I just cannot get myself to do anything. If I am not leaving the house and it's a gloomy day, I just can't get out of bed. I was so sleepy this entire weekend. I'm filming this on a Monday. The entire weekend it was so gloomy and I just could not get myself to do anything. I was trying to, okay, like I need to clean my room. I need to do this. I need to do my research for a podcast and everything. And I just could not do it. Thankfully, I have basically already finished the rest of the research that I did for this episode. But I don't know, just something about the gloomy weather and not being able to get out of bed. Today, it's nice and sunny out. I have some water with me. I have some coffee. So we're like up and going, thankfully. But oh my gosh, you guys, I really could not. I don't know what it is. I just couldn't get out of bed this weekend. Now, I also want to say I've kind of already been doing this pattern at this point, but I think what I'm going to do for this podcast is do a video episode every other week. So I've already kind of been doing that pattern every other week unknowingly, but I think that's the most sustainable way for me to do things. I realize because when I'm doing those video podcasts and I'm editing it, they take up so much storage on my computer and it takes a significantly longer amount of time for me to edit those versus the audio versions. Any editors, you guys would know, like Final Cut Pro, it just takes up a lot of space and it just takes me a little bit longer to get everything going. I have like a 4-year-old MacBook Air, she's not super old, but she's getting up there and she's a little bit on the weaker side. So it just takes me a bit more time when it comes to the video podcast, which is fine. I love doing the video podcast. I think it's much more interactive in that way. But for me to do this sustainably and to kind of get more of a flow when it comes to my schedule, I would prefer to do an audio podcast every other week too, just because it's easier for me to pop out the content that way. Also, depending on the topic that we're doing, sometimes there's content that I would love to put in the video version, but sometimes it can turn into copyright issues and things like that. This one was one of them. So this way I can also funnel the order in which I want to do the episodes. And yeah, I just think this is a more sustainable way for me to do my content. So just wanted to let you guys know. But this week, I wanted to talk about a trend that I've been seeing pop up pretty often in the last few years, a trend that I would like to call the reality television to documentary pipeline. So I've always loved documentaries. That's something that I feel like I have phases throughout my life where I just binge only documentary content. And I would say that my favorite subgenre of documentaries is pop culture, obviously, but also political and sports related documentaries. For some reason, I am always so captivated by sports documentaries. I'm not a sports girly at all. You will never catch me watching an NBA game. You will never catch me watching an F1 race. But Drive to Survive, The Last Dance, like I am obsessed with sports documentaries. It's something about the drama and the story of it all that's really captivating to me. But like when it comes to the games itself, like I don't really care. The Last Dance got me into watching all of the basketball documentaries. Like I watch The Last Dance at least once a year, dead ass. Like it is one of my favorite documentaries of all time. And I know a lot of sports fans say that it's like extremely biased towards Michael Jordan. I don't care. Like it's just so good cinematically. The storytelling, the Redeem Team on Netflix. I wasn't a huge fan of that one as much, to be honest. I thought it was kind of boring. But the Untold series covers a lot of athletes as well. I've watched the David Beckham's documentary on Netflix too. That one was really well done. I don't know. It's just something about the theatrics of sports that a documentary captures so well that I'm obsessed with. I think there's also another one about the legacy of the Lakers. That one was also really well done. I just love sports documentaries. Like I don't know, like that's also just one of my niches. Like I know nothing about sports, but something about a sports documentary, you have me sat. Obviously, I love pop culture documentaries. Sometimes I will watch like a show or a movie and be like, they need to make a documentary about this one day. Like sometimes the behind the scenes action or drama is more interesting than the show or the movie itself, one of the ones that I'm really looking forward to in the next couple years is the documentary about Euphoria. Like the behind the scenes drama is arguably way more interesting than what the show has become. And I just love getting more of the inside scoop. And that's actually one of the things that we'll be talking about in this episode. And I would say the reason why I love pop culture documentaries so much is that it forces you to do the thing that I love about pop culture. I love pop culture, period, but the reason why I'm so fascinated by it is because it's a direct reflection of society or political or economic issues in the world. It gives you a glimpse of that time period and what people are thinking about then. And pop culture arguably is a lot more highbrow than people would expect. Like, I don't think people realize how important pop culture really is, and a documentary really helps people look at pop culture that way. It kind of forces you to look at the impacts that it made or how it shifts people's perception on certain things. And that's what I love so much about pop culture in general and how I like to engage with it. And a documentary really helps you to do that. And I would say most recently, the documentaries that have been grabbing my attention have been centered around various reality shows or daytime television shows from the past. And I also love reality shows. If I'm not watching them, I also like watching people give commentary about certain reality shows. I think there's a lot of ways that you can engage with reality shows through a psychological or anthropological lens, which is central to my love of pop culture. But I'm not gonna lie, I haven't really watched any new reality shows in a while. None of them have really been catching my attention like that. I would say the most recent reality show I watched was Love Island USA season 6. So that's like 2 years ago. And sometimes I'll still watch the Kardashians or see what like the Jersey Shore cast is up to every now and then. But I haven't really been able to get into any of the newer shows. I think the last one I tried to watch is Netflix's Age of Attraction. Like, I don't know. I just did it just didn't click with me. I've watched Love is Blind. I've watched The Ultimatum as well, and those are pretty good, but I don't watch them religiously like a lot of other people do. But if you're looking at this type of media where they are going back and reflecting on reality shows, there's already sort of like a content inception happening here where reality TV, like it's in the name, it's supposed to be more fixed in reality. And reality TV is already presented in this way where it sells you a certain concept of reality. But then when you really think about it, reality television is kind of an oxymoron in a lot of ways. But then the documentary format is an additional layer of perceived reality and retrospection. So, first, I kind of want to look at why these reality show documentaries have become popular in the most recent years. So, the three main factors that I feel like contribute to this is that there's a completely new generation and perspective through different cultural shifts and the access to media. I think with streaming and with the internet, it opens the door for new audiences to come about with these reality shows. One of the most prominent reality shows that I would say that had a resurgence of a new audience is America's Next Top Model. And we're going to be talking about the documentary that came out on Netflix that covers America's Next Top Model. And one of the things they talk about is during COVID, there was a huge wave of a new audience that was watching and binging the show. And I think binge culture specifically opened up the doors for these controversial reality shows to gain a new audience. And I think it's important to note that we've never engaged with old media that way before. Of course, if you take like a media analysis class, you can go back and look at old media and see how things have changed. The way that we perceive things have completely shifted. But we've never seen that happen in real time to make a societal shift or conversation on a massive scale. We were kind of able to just let the past live in the past. But when there's a whole resurgence with the internet and social media and the way people are talking about it, it kind of opens the door for this new conversation to be had. And that creates a new opportunity for new content. And that's being shown in the documentary format. Now, the second factor I would say, which I kind of talked about earlier, is exposing the reality of the reality. We're kind of unraveling the real mission statement of the reality show. And I think it's really interesting because at the end of the day, even though we know what we're watching is often highly produced and curated and very much set up for us to see, we still want to see something authentic. And I think that's what reality shows are marketed as, and so are documentaries. So it kind of creates this extra layer of authenticity that we're supposedly seeing. I think a really big selling point when it comes to media in general is like, this was all fake, and now this is the real thing that we're showing right now. And it always works. We always fall for it, whether or not it's actually authentic or not. And we're going to see that with the documentaries that we're going to observe today. And I think exposing, quote unquote, the reality of the reality, it will always work, whether or not it's actually successful in doing so, because it just constantly feeds back into that content loop. And then the last factor I would say is this supposed taking accountability aspect of the documentary and reflecting on the makings of this reality show. And I think specifically with Gen Z, we are very much obsessed with the ethics and holding people accountable for their actions and their impacts and their mistakes. And that ended up becoming a really big selling point of these documentaries, where they look back on these crazy things that these producers had to do for these shows to be successful, and we wouldn't be able to get away with that in this day and age, and be like, but that was just the times, and just like explaining the context in which these shows were created. And like I said for the previous point, it doesn't actually matter if these documentaries achieve that. We're going to look at these documentaries, and I would say all three of them are not that great at actually holding themselves accountable, quote unquote, for the controversial things that came about because of these reality shows. And I find it really interesting because they create this facade of holding deep reflection on the impacts of these certain shows and what certain individuals had in partaking in it. But at the end of the day, nothing is actually being done about it because reality shows are inherently exploitative, and so are documentaries in a lot of ways. And so they're creating this facade in the same way that these reality shows were created in the documentary. It's the same exact actions just continuously being repackaged, and that's what I find so fascinating. And you will also see when we talk about these documentaries, and if you watch them, I highly recommend that you watch all three that we're going to talk about today, because I do find them really fascinating, is that everyone was aware. Everyone was aware of the exploitative nature of the shows that they were participating in. And yet now they're coming back for this documentary to reflect on their actions, supposedly. But in reality, they're just doing the same exact thing repackaged. And I just find it so interesting because a lot of it sometimes can feel redundant, and you will see it based on the feedback that some of these documentaries got. But they're just looking back at the exploitative nature of these shows by exploiting them again. So that it's like, what is the point? And maybe that is the point, that at the end of the day, when it comes to creating entertainment in the form of television, there's always going to be that factor, and there's not really anything that we can do with it other than repackage it for people to continue to be entertained. And if anything, I feel like with some of these reality show documentaries, it's kind of a different way of creating a reboot, essentially. Not in the exact same way where they're literally creating just like a newer generation version of it, but it is repackaged for the new generation to look back on these controversial but very popular reality shows, but feel like there's some type of accountability being taken or actual reflection on the exploitative nature of these shows, when in reality, it's still just the same thing in a different font, essentially. Because with our new generation, if you just create a reboot of the reality show, which there very much are those versions, and I've seen it happen, and apparently I'm not exactly sure with the America's Next Top Model documentary. At the very end, Tyra Banks kind of teases like a reboot of Cycle 25, which I don't know if that's actually happening, but when I finished watching that documentary, I was like, oh, so this was just to promote a reboot. But sometimes that doesn't work given how controversial the show actually was. And people are like, well, have you learned nothing? Why are you making a reboot? And then it's not successful. But sometimes it will be successful because they're like, okay, well, let's see what they do differently this time. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm starting to ramble, but like, I do think it's a different way to reboot the popularity of a show. So the three documentaries that we're going to be looking at for this episode covers America's Next Top Model, The Biggest Loser, and Jerry Springer. Now, these three documentaries have very similar formats, but they were very different in my opinion. So we're going to look at them one by one and also compare and contrast them. But even though they felt very different, I feel like the format itself was pretty much the same. So now I want to explain the general format and structure of these documentaries because they all kind of go through the exact same timeline. So first, they talk about the genesis of the show and the original mission statement. So obviously every show's objective is to be entertaining and generate profit. But there's always this supposed mission statement that they create for the audience to follow. So for America's Next Top Model, Tyra says that her objective with the show was to open the door to creating a more diverse range of models within the industry. Or Biggest Loser is to transform these people's lives, and we just want to give them a major physical transformation to change their lives. And then Jerry Springer, they were kind of more outwardly ridiculous. Their true mission statement aligns the most with just keeping eyes on the screen for them, which is just display the most ridiculous and outlandish life stories and perspectives and just put them on TV for people to watch. So even though all of them still have the same objectives, their mission statements all look a little different. And then afterwards, they start examining why the show was so appealing to people. So they kind of just reflect on the insane popularity of the show. Like, we couldn't believe it. Like, they just do this whole shtick about how they had no expectations for this show to be as successful as it was, and everyone was talking about it, and like the major cultural impacts that the show had during the times. And then later on, as the shows become more successful, they have to start raising the stakes. So that leads to a lot of controversy or harm. So they provide a bit more context into the incentive of it all. So when the producers are talking about they needed to up the stakes because they needed to keep more viewers, they had to keep people watching. So that's when you start seeing the interviews of the production team or the decisions that executives had to make and so on and so forth. So that's a bit more going into the behind the scenes of it all that we don't see when we just watch these reality shows. And then they start to go into the falling action as to why these shows ended. Usually with these shows, there's like a big moment where something went a little too far. So then that's when the audience perception starts to shift. So then audience are starting to think, wow, maybe this is something that we shouldn't be watching. Maybe this is something that we shouldn't be supporting. And then they sort of end with, is there a lesson to be learned type of thing. So they kind of talk about their reflections of the show, what they would have done differently. They kind of sprinkle that throughout the entire documentary, but then they go into how they apply those reflections and lessons into later on in their life, like where is the production team now? Where are these contestants now? Type of thing. Now we're going to be looking at all three documentaries on an individual level. Now, I will say all three of these are on Netflix if you want to go stream them, but I have a different relationship to all of these shows, which I found interesting. I think that's where my perspective differentiates. So I remember watching America's Next Top Model as a child. Like, I remember that being definitely a part of my childhood, and I was obsessed with it. I remember binging it. I didn't realize there was this huge resurgence of an audience, specifically with America's Next Top Model during COVID, but that was really interesting to look back on in the documentary. And then The Biggest Loser, I remember it being a really big show, but I never watched it. And I remember when I became a bit older, like in my teenage years, there was a lot of controversy because some contestants had started to come out saying like there were really unhealthy practices that were being done on this show, and like they started speaking out about it, and that created a lot of controversy. That was like the first time I really remember being sentient of the show Biggest Loser. Like I just remember the name being around, but then when contestants started to come out years later, it was the first time where I was like, oh, there's this show about like these very obese people that are going on this show to lose weight and stuff like that. And then Jerry Springer, I just remember people always being like, this was the most ridiculous daytime television show on earth. Like, I think it continued on as I was growing up, but it like its peak had happened like before I was even born. So I think that's also important to take into account. I'm sure that millennials who have watched these shows at a much older age and of that time, I think they would have a much different perspective going into these documentaries. And when I was looking up different feedback, whether it was on Reddit or just different discussion forums about these documentaries, I'm assuming most of them were millennials because they were like, they didn't even talk about like the crazy shit that actually happened, or like they were always kind of like missing a little bit more. But for me, specifically with Biggest Loser and Jerry Springer, being a completely new viewer, it was so interesting to me because I was like, I didn't even realize this stuff happened. And I think that's also important to take into account. Like, who are these documentaries really for? Is it for people who have been watching these shows since years ago, or is it for a completely new audience? I think it's definitely for both. But then that ends up with the critical reception being a bit more polarizing. And is that also good or bad? I think that's also kind of the reality controversial aspect of it too, right? If that makes any sense. So first we're going to be talking about reality check inside America's Next Top Model. Now, if I'm going to be honest, I kind of went into this documentary with no real expectations because I knew Tyra Banks was going to be in this documentary. So I just kind of had the expectation of like, oh, they're going to be really surface level with this given that Tyra Banks is actually involved. So I would say I was pleasantly surprised by this. I'm not shocked that Tyra Banks or the creators of the show didn't really take accountability for anything that they did on the show, but I think they went deeper into specific storylines and things like that than I had expected. So, what I realized watching this documentary is that the show itself, America's Next Top Model, was highly banking on the ignorance of the audience when it comes to the inner workings of the modeling industry. So, Tyra claims that the mission statement of this show was to create more of a diverse range of models in the industry. So we're given this idea that through this competition show, they'll be given the opportunity of a lifetime to become a supermodel or something like that. But we learned through this documentary that that wasn't the reality. And a lot of these models actually were not given a lot of opportunities because they are now seen as coming from a reality television background. Because if you think about it now, if you come from reality TV, it's so much easier to become an influencer or like to pivot your career path after the reality show ends. But that wasn't really an option back in the day. If anything, it hurt your chances more of being taken seriously in an industry like modeling. And it made me think like, well, if America's Next Top Model were to be a show that reoccurs today, it would be much more of a realistic opportunity for people to change their lives and careers. And also, looking back at this show now, we see that the mission statement of the show and its execution was actually completely hypocritical because Tyra had gone into making this show to create a more diverse range and representation of models while still perpetuating those biases and those stereotypes of the modeling industry onto these contestants. But I also think that's a very Gen Z perspective because if you listen to millennials and how they took this documentary, they agree that America's Next Top Model was a step in the right direction of creating a more diverse range of models in the industry. And the audience also looks at Tyra Banks as a reliable figure in the modeling industry to break these societal norms and represent like a new generation of supermodels. But I also think the public perception of Tyra Banks has ultimately changed over the years And she is now looked at someone who upkeeps the status quo of the modeling industry and perpetuates the toxic culture that comes within the modeling industry. And in this documentary, she really does not come off well, which was why I was surprised that she agreed to do this, because she doesn't really take responsibility for anything. She kind of, any time that they were talking about a specific storyline in the show, she was kind of like, well, that's the editor's issue, or I'm not part of production. Like, she would always kind of dodge any type of responsibility when she was also very much a part of the production process of the show. But when it came to talking about the popularity of the show or the cultural impacts of the show, she would be like, this was all me. Like, it just came off really PR to me, which is not surprising at all. And then going back to talking about where the contestants ended up going after the show, it reminded me a lot of like American Idol or The Voice, like those competition singing shows where they're sold a dream for an opportunity to enter the music industry, but then in reality, like nothing ever really happens. Specifically, The Voice, like I don't know anyone who was actually successful off The Voice other than maybe Melanie Martinez and Morgan Wallen. And there's so many different variations of that show, and it's been going on for years, and the only people that I can name from that came from that show are like two or three out of how many seasons. Like, that's what I was really thinking about when I was watching this documentary too. And again, going back to how the reality TV and influencer space has evolved, I feel like this show would really be an opportunity for people now, but it wasn't like that back then. And then another thing that I found really interesting that I hadn't thought about at all when watching the show was how the different challenges, editorial concepts that these models were forced to do, they essentially could not put them on their actual modeling portfolio because they just had so many bizarre concepts. Like, they were talking about the race swapping concept or the domestic violence crime concepts. Like, they were just so ridiculous. And that's also something that they sell as something that they need to learn about to be a model, but it really has nothing to do with being a model. Like, there's no editorial shoot that you would be forced to like to do like a domestic violence concept. You know what I mean? Like, it was just so ridiculous, and that's something that was created to up the ante of the show, but it wasn't actually like helpful to the supposed mission statement of the show. Now, another aspect to this content feedback loop that I've been noticing is how people respond on social media, and specifically with Reality Check. I saw this in real time, which I thought was really fascinating. So they talk about how America's Next Top Model had a resurgence during COVID, and a lot of people were talking about the problematic aspects of the show on social media during COVID when they were binging or rewatching the show. And that essentially, that was kind of like a landmark in the pop culture timeline of like, things are now changing. People have different perspectives on this show that was so popular, and it's still popular. I would actually argue that America's Next Top Model is one of those shows that actually has good rewatch value. Like, no one is rewatching American Idol. You know, like old seasons of American Idol, or they're not rewatching Biggest Loser or Jerry Springer, you know what I mean? But America's Next Top Model has somewhat of a rewatch value, and that's why it became so popular during COVID again. And then when this documentary came out, everyone was talking about it again. And that essentially feeds back into the content loop again, where people, even though they didn't really get what they want, like I saw a lot of TikToks of people being like, no one was held accountable for anything, and like Tyra didn't even say much in this documentary, like why was she even there? Like, people had their own criticisms about the show, but they're still watching, and then they're still creating content to essentially promote the show, whether that was their intention or not. And like I said earlier, at the end of the documentary, Tyra Banks essentially teases that they're going to do a cycle 25. So then that made me think at the end, I was like, did I really just watch this as for them to promote a reboot of this show? Like, I felt kind of duped, but also it's like, Of course they would. Of course, that's also my theory as to why Tyra even agreed to do this documentary, was to potentially promote a reboot, which I don't know if that was ever confirmed that they're really going to do a reboot, but it sounded like it. The fact that Tyra even said that in the documentary. And the popularity of this documentary is probably going to at least bring some viewers back to the reboot, right? Personally, I don't think it would be the smartest to do a reboot because they've tried to keep that show on for as long as they really could. At a certain point, Rita Ora was hosting the show and Tyra had left. So it's just like, I feel like it would be unnecessary, but I wouldn't be surprised if they do it. Overall, I really enjoyed this documentary more than I had expected to. There's a lot of different storylines that they revisit that you will see in a completely different light, whether you're a Gen Z, whether you're a millennial, just because there's new information that's being provided in the doc. And I think it's really telling of how we look at certain things when it comes to sexual assault, sexual harassment, racism, queer representation. I think it's just a really good look at how things have changed so much over the years. And I would even say that for Biggest Loser, actually, which we'll now segue into. So, based on the research that I did about Fit for TV after I had watched the documentary, is that a lot of viewers thought that it was very surface level. There wasn't any new information provided about the show itself. They thought that doing 3 episodes was kind of unnecessary, like it could have just been one long episode. Someone had actually said in the Reddit discussion that they actually had an improved opinion of the show after watching the documentary. They always felt it was nonsense reality trash, but if that's the worst they could dig up, maybe it wasn't all that bad. Which I don't know if everyone would agree with that notion, but I also feel like that is the main consensus when everyone was watching this documentary. Like, we knew that this show was unethical, but we still watched it. If anything, there were also a lot of comments referring to another show called The Swan, saying that The Biggest Loser was pretty much just one out of many that glamorize skinny bodies, that continue to perpetuate toxic habits when it comes to diet culture. But given that the reception for this documentary was kind of like, okay, and so what? It also had another group of people kind of saying, this was exactly what I knew the show to be since the beginning. Like, there was no need for a documentary to explain why this was harmful because we already knew that. And for contestants that may have gained the weight back or maybe gained more weight after the show, there's also a lot of people that are like, well, yeah, if you don't keep up the lifestyle and if you lose weight really fast, it's also, you can just gain it back just as fast. And so I think there's a lot of nuance that needs to be had when it comes to conversation of weight loss, diet culture, body image issues, which I find to be the main difference when it comes to holding people accountable, quote unquote, compared to America's Next Top Model, for example. Because when it comes to entering a certain industry that is highly selective, a lot of things are completely out of your control. But when it comes to weight loss or lifestyle changes, a lot of people look at that as something that has to be within your control, and that's something that you have to be dedicated to changing. So I think with a lot of viewers of this documentary and of The Biggest Loser, a lot of the responsibility is still on the contestants themselves, because at the end of the day, it is just a competition diet show. And also, a lot of the aftermath is completely out of the show's control as well, given the change in lifestyle. But I will say, as someone who has never watched The Biggest Loser and went into watching this documentary, it was interesting to learn kind of the contestants' testimonies in a sense, and just seeing their perspective of being a contestant on the show, how it's changed their own perception of themselves and their bodies afterwards. And specifically, the contestants that came out later talking about how they felt like some of the things that they were pressured into was unethical, whether it was drugs that were given to them. I believe it was caffeine pills or something like that. I don't remember exactly. But the doctor on the show actually sued one of the contestants for defamation. And I think that's also really interesting for conversation when it comes to who is actually responsible for the things that happens on a reality show. what are the boundaries when it comes to ethics, manufactured consent on a reality show? And that's why I feel like the whole facade of taking accountability never really works when it comes to this pipeline, even though they continue to try and push it for a marketing strategy. Because at the end of the day, the entire structure of reality television is exploitative, and there are contestants that are willing to be exploited in these settings. But then once things don't go their way, they sort of put blame on their own experiences on the show. And I think Biggest Loser is kind of just another example in another format of a fad diet. You want to lose weight really fast and you find this trendy new diet and you try to transform your life in a really fast way that's not sustainable. And The Biggest Loser also feeds into that narrative. But in reality, everyone knows how to lose weight. 9 times out of 10, there's not going to be this magic thing that you can take or this magic experience that will absolutely transform you forever to have your dream body. Like, that takes work, that takes a lifestyle change. But there's also so many other things that go into that, right? When it comes to genetics, when it comes to eating disorders. And that's just not something that a reality television show can take accountability for. And I also think specifically Bob Harper talking about his heart attack years after the show and basically using that story as a way to show that health looks different for everyone. Just because you are extremely athletic doesn't make you not prone to certain illnesses or health issues. I think just in general, whenever health and body image are conflated, it just creates so many discussions that become harmful because health and body image essentially there's not as much correlation as you would think. But that was such a norm back in the day. And I think now we're more aware of it. I mean, I think there's definitely still a culture where that is conflated. People still think that there's a correlation all the time, but I just think there are deeper conversations to be had that a reality show or a documentary can't always fully look at or grasp. Now, I will say this is definitely one of those shows that probably will not have a reboot ever. I think the shift in the culture has changed so much to the point where this would never be greenlit today. So I definitely think the documentary was kind of a cash grab in a sense. But because there wasn't that much new information that we got from this documentary, I feel like there wasn't as much buzz created around it once the documentary was released because there was no new information. There was no new conversation to be had about this show other than the fact that we knew it was unethical. It would never happen today. And there just needs to be a bigger conversation about diet culture and the body image issues that are perpetuated in society. And so, lastly, I want to talk about Jerry Springer. The doc is called Jerry Springer Fights Camera Action. And I would say that this documentary and show are a bit of an outlier compared to Biggest Loser and America's Next Top Model. One, because it's a daytime TV show, and it was also just so outwardly ridiculous, and that was the crux of the show. Like, people weren't watching Jerry Springer thinking that it's going to be some highbrow daytime television show like an Oprah. They watched it because it was so trashy. Like, I think with Biggest Loser, that sentiment is there as well, but they're still trying to sell this dream of like absolutely transforming your body and changing your life. But people knew in the back of their minds that Biggest Loser was essentially like this fat phobic humiliation ritual. And people knew that in the back of their minds that this was not a sustainable way to lose weight or transform your body. But with Jerry Springer, it's like you're just getting ridiculous shit, and that's what you're here for. We're keeping you hooked because of how ridiculous our show is, and that's what it is. I think the biggest reveal of this documentary was that the producers would actively rile up the contestants to before they would get on the show so that they can make crazy TV moments. I thought this documentary was interesting compared to the other two in the sense that they focus more on the producers a lot in the show rather than the contestants or the guest appearances. And I think they do that because the show Jerry Springer is much more outwardly explicit with the main goal of the show, which is just to show ridiculous stories and humans, but they give you more of a inside scoop on the production aspect of it in terms of how they find these insane stories and how they fluff them up for TV as well. And for this documentary, there was no accountability taken at all because I think they weren't holding themselves accountable to begin with. Like there was no mission statement that was lost on this show. Like it was always just supposed to be ridiculous, trashy, and that's why you watch it. And another really big outlier is the fact that Jerry Springer had passed away a couple years, so he was not actually giving commentary on his experience hosting the show. I do want to read this one comment I saw on Reddit, which I think really encapsulates my own thoughts on the documentary. I did like how it allowed the producers to tell their story, which naturally showed the irony of their strong convictions about not being responsible for the guests, but then the juxtaposition of how shitty they felt, how stressful it all was. Like it's right there, but they still don't get it. Really a sign of the times, in my opinion. And also how they maintained it wasn't fake yet. They clearly tried to rev them up and manipulate what they say and how they act. They are all scum, and a few of them you can see suffered for it because you know that they either consciously or subconsciously know they're garbage for their part. Also, I was shaking my head at how mad they were at Oprah for saying comments about Jerry Springer being tasteless, and they were like, go after the show, not the man. What the fuck? He is the face and the name of the show. Springer, by the way, was absolutely complicit and tried to make light of it by saying as much, which for me was even more infuriating because he knows he can't defend it. So he just does his boyish, jokey joke shtick. And I think that's so true. Like, I think the issue with a lot of these documentaries is that some of these people who come back for the documentary to reflect on their experiences can't see the hypocrisy in all of it, which is so interesting to me. I feel like if they're able to come to terms with that, it would feel more authentic. But I also think some of the creators of these shows, or the producers, or the contestants, like genuinely don't see the hypocrisy in some of these things. But it also kind of shows the amount of cognitive dissonance that you kind of need to have in order to participate in this kind of content loop. And I also think that is an aspect of our entertainment, to just see how out of touch some of these people are, even after years of reflecting back on their own experiences. I also think about how some of these producers or contestants choose to exploit themselves again in this documentary format. And although it is still exploitative at the end of the day, does it provide them some type of closure when it comes to their own experiences on the show? That's what I find really interesting. Like, for example, the producers on Jerry Springer, they talk about like their own personal struggles and how hard it was to be on that show, but they're still willing to retell their own experiences to be exploited again in this documentary format. Same with the Biggest Loser contestants or America's Next Top Model contestants, you know what I mean? And a show like Jerry Springer, while we would never get something like Jerry Springer again, I think there's different forms of it. Like Biggest Loser, I feel like that's kind of a show that is very outdated and just wouldn't really work in today's day and age. But Jerry Springer, there's like different formats of that, I think. Like when I first watched the Jerry Springer documentary, I instantly thought of Mr. Beast. Like, I feel like Mr. Beast is another format of Jerry Springer, right? And that is still insanely popular with people. And they're not like the perfect comparisons because I do think Mr. Beast tries to position himself as like some philanthropic content creator, which I feel like I will definitely get a documentary about Mr. Beast one day, right? Like there's definitely something dark sided about Mr. Beast in a similar way that Jerry Springer was. But that type of trashy, pretty outwardly unethical type of content is still very much entertaining and still very much alive in this day and age too. So then it just goes back into that conversation of that content feedback loop. Like, did we actually learn anything from this? Does this actually change anything? So I feel like those are kind of like my main takeaways when it comes to this reality TV to documentary pipeline. There's no actual way to take accountability for what happens during these shows because these contestants and producers are exploited in the show and then they're exploited again in the documentary. There's no way to take accountability for exploitation when the format itself is inherently exploitative and it's shaped differently, but it's created for the same exact motive, which is viewership. And I guess the big difference compared to the time then versus now is that content creators have joined in on the feedback loop through the internet, through discussion forums, through social media, talking about the original show and their perspective during that time and the documentary now and what they expect from the documentary and what they expect for people to revisit in that content. And in reality, it doesn't really change much, but we're just constantly in this loop of creating new content for the sake of our entertainment. And I just find that really interesting. So yeah, that's this week's episode. I know I didn't really go into details of each documentary. I wanted to just kind of go over the main format and how each show slash documentary tries to address their own controversies in a way and how each format kind of differs depending on the show and kind of looking at what conversations it actually sparks based on the different mission statements that these shows push. I don't really know if there's like a conclusion that I've come to with this episode because at the end of the day, it's just kind of looping on top of itself constantly, and there's not really a cohesive resolution that we can come to with these shows because these reality shows and this content will just continue to be created as long as there's viewership. It's just a matter of how they will shift with the times and culture. But this was definitely one of the first topics that I thought of when creating this podcast. I mean, the podcast name is called Culture Feeds, and we're literally talking about a cultural feedback loop that happens with reality TV and documentary. So I found it really interesting. I hope this was still an interesting conversation, even though there wasn't really a resolution to take at the end of it. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Let me know your thoughts, and I will see you guys later this week. Bye.